Um, Awesome. Cody, I was just about to ask about reporting. Thank you. So this is our building on our 2 prior webinars where we have talked about NATO's history of expansion and aggression, and NATO's aggression in the Americas, Africa, and Palestine. I'm Katie. I'm with Irish Americans for Palestine, and I'm going to be emceeing this evening. And our lineup of presenters includes Dinanda, Ariel, Swetha, Cody, Rolando, and Nusha. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And please keep introducing yourselves in the comments. It's really great to get to know everyone. So we are the Resist NATO Coalition. We are a coalition that has come together to oppose the US-led military alliance and the NATO summit that is held in DC this July. We have members across the country who have been working to mobilize a counter summit and other resistance actions, and we're going to share more detail about that at the end of the webinar. Our coalition members have agreed to the following points of unity that you can see on the screen, and I will just read them now. So we oppose NATO as a US-led military alliance that is a prime actor in imperialist wars of aggression and military occupation, resulting in the deaths and displacement of millions of people. We oppose US-NATO strategy of expansionism and intensification of militarization across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, all at the service of US geopolitical and economic interests. We oppose US-NATO strategy of security through wars of counterterrorism, insurgency, and mass surveillance. We support the right of peoples and nations to self-determination and sovereignty and their right to resistance against imperialist aggression. And we support a just peace through resolving the root causes of armed conflicts, allocating resources not to the war industry, but to serve people's needs. So we can go on to the next slide. Awesome. So this is our agenda for this evening. We are going to discuss the history of the NATO counterterrorism pillar, including the Cold War and a case study of Operation Gladio. We will talk about NATO's counterterrorism pillar in depth. And then we will talk about how that has been applied to different countries, including the US, the Philippines, and India. If you have questions as we go, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to pull questions out of the chat so I make sure that nothing gets lost and that we have a good list. But we will do questions at the end of the webinar. And so I believe now Dinanda is going to get us started.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dinanda, and I'll be talking about the historical context of NATO and going into McCarthyism and all of that stuff. But basically, the historical context of NATO is the US's political structure and society as a whole is controlled by a class of monopoly business owners, bankers, and investors, which is often referred to as the financial oligarchy. And the US's political structure's closest allies are the carceral state, which are police, armies, courts, and prisons, protecting its economic interests. Thus, they've used basically every repressive element of the state to repulse the inevitable resistance of the exploited classes, whose labor basically creates their wealth, these financial oligarchs' wealth, and the oppressed social sectors whose societal mistreatment keeps the exploited classes divided. In the beginning of the 20th century, a new centralized strategy of counterinsurgency was needed for the imperial United States. And as a lot of you might know, the Espionage Act of 1917 was passed to criminalize those who protested the United States entering into World War I, and has since been used to convict leaders of people's movements and whistleblowers of secret military programs. And an example of the Espionage Act being used was recently during the Obama and Trump administration to prosecute suspected national security leakers such as Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, and most recently Reality Winner. Next slide, please. So following World War II and the US's rise to global capitalist superpower, the socialist states and national liberation movements challenging imperialism became the greatest threat to the US ruling system. And as part of the US's rise to global capitalist superpower, this is how basically NATO was formed. This led the US government to mobilize each of its branches against anyone engaged or who could be accused of engaging in movements for social and political change. And these came in two waves. And the first wave is the McCarthyist Senate hearings against un-American activities in the 1950s. So basically, at the heart of the repressive atmosphere was like the investigatory and anti-communist committee called the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which is HUAC. An example of this, and someone who has been targeted by these McCarthyist Senate hearings and the HUAC, was baseball player Jackie Robinson, who had testified in the House of Un-American Activities as a way for the government to make sure Robinson was loyal to the US government. Like he basically had to take like a loyalty oath, and he had to testify against Paul Robeson, who basically had communist sympathies, and Jackie Robinson was not having it. Basically was like, I'm not going to testify against Paul Robeson, but what I will say was he basically like the Jim Crow laws. He basically was like, you know, voiced out against Jim Crow laws because he wasn't having it in terms of like, he wasn't going against Paul Robeson. And then the second wave was FBI's counterintelligence program, which is COINTELPRO in the 1960s and 70s, that basically surveilled, imprisoned, and assassinated national liberation and civil rights organizers, all while unleashing deadly counterinsurgency operations against nations abroad. An example of this was COINTELPRO's targeting of a wide range of activists, including the Black Liberation Movement, including the Black Panthers, which honestly, the COINTELPRO was established, I believe, the COINTELPRO was established 1 year within the formation of the Black Panther Party. It was established to, quote unquote, to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalists. And then COINTELPRO operations that successfully infiltrated Puerto Rican independence movement, the Mexican liberation movement, and the Native American liberation movement, and led to the incarceration and death of many activists, including Leonard Peltier, who was a part of the Native American liberation movement, who was just recently, I think I heard the news today, denied parole. So, and then as well as Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was targeted by COINTELPRO because of his ties to the Black Panther Party, who has been incarcerated since 1982. Okay, next slide. NATO has been the most utilized tool of imperial war since the Soviet Union fell in 1991. So it basically evolved into an instrument of imperialist expansion. The sole purpose of NATO's creation in 1949 was to, quote unquote, contain revolutionary socialism wherever it emerged. The US found a convenient replacement of the word communist with terrorist to basically usher in a new doctrine of counterterrorism logic to protect its ruling system and the ruling class. An example of this was the 9/11 attacks against the United States was basically used as a pretext by the Bush administration to pass the Patriot Act, which basically legalized, expanded, and even like popularized the same surveillance tactics used under COINTELPRO, but it is now overwhelmingly targets Muslim communities. And that's it for my section.
Okay, thanks, Dananda. So just to introduce myself, my name is Ariel. I'm from DGROW NYC. I'm going to double click into a case study about one of NATO's most effective campaigns to defeat terrorism, also known as communism. So as Dananda said, the end of World War II was the beginning of the US-led Cold War to defeat communism worldwide. So we may all be familiar with some of the years-long conflicts and outright wars where communist movements had strength and widespread support, such as the Vietnam War. But the US and Britain also conducted secret operations to make sure that they had a ready presence wherever they had identified real potential for communist movements to gain popular support. So one of these campaigns of secret operations was called Operation Gladio, which used popular tactics to fight terrorism or communism. So these tactics involved states committing acts of terrorism against their own people and then blaming the left for these violent attacks. So these particular tactics were really effective in breeding distrust among the people against leftist movements, to alienate the leftist entities and parties from the people, and simultaneously scare civilians to the point where they have no choice but to turn to the state for support and safety, at which point they are ready to comply with essentially what is an increasingly fascist state and militarized state. So double-clicking into how Operation Gladio actually defeated and undermined the communists and anarchists in Italy. They employed two tactics, the strategy of tension and false flags. So both of these tactics together are exactly as I described, where they would commit acts of terrorism against civilians in order to spread fear. So in the 60s and 80s, the Italian state bombed their own civilians. They kidnapped and murdered politicians and stockpiled weapons and explosives that they could use all throughout Italy, and to also support any covert operations that needed those weapons throughout their secret network. And here are just a few examples in case you want to learn more about some of these instances of domestic terrorism committed by the Italian state. So I'm going to put this full interview, a link to it in the chat. But I wanted to focus on this one quote from this interview with a Gladio operative arrested in 1984. So basically, their intention was very clear, and by their own admission, right? So they were supposed to attack civilians, women, children, people who are considered the most vulnerable and innocent outside of a political context. So intentionally destabilizing outside of a political context in order to garner fear, right? And the reason is plain. So basically you get the people scared enough to be willing to trade a lot of things that they were fighting for the sake of their own safety, right? And at this point, because of the destabilization, the distrust on the left or looking at the left, they have to turn to the state in order to provide for their basic needs. Okay, so a lot of these tactics may sound familiar, right? We see them today. And the success of Operation Gladio and its legacy actually extends to a lot of the tactics that Western imperialism and NATO continue to employ around the world. However, we also see media play an even greater role as Western imperialism's primary tactics are brute force and the manipulation of the truth, right? So two examples that we see domestically are atrocities in the US committed by the police are actually blamed on protesters and are reshaped through propaganda or pro-cop propaganda to fuel the establishment of cop cities around the US and breed fear against a growing police abolition movement. Another example, very relevant today, is the atrocities committed by the Israeli state and those atrocities being blamed on Hamas and Palestinian civilians in Gaza by Western media to fuel the Zionist project and genocide of Palestinians. So this is why you may have seen a popular phrase or statement going around: every accusation is a confession by Israel. So the Israeli state commits these atrocities, frames Hamas and the Palestinian people in order to justify the ongoing genocide. So as I said, the tactics and success of Operation Gladio have been carried forward as NATO continues to expand its counterterrorism program and its membership. So NATO now operates covertly everywhere with the support of its 32 member nations. As a result of NATO's aggression against Russia and Ukraine in 2022, for example, Sweden and Finland joined NATO just last year and this year. So NATO is actively growing its membership and garnering its support across Europe. And its reach and activities have continued to destabilize people's movements worldwide. However, we want to make clear that people's movements have successfully resisted NATO's tactics and interventions. Just days ago, the US-backed coup in Bolivia failed to oust the democratically elected socialist president. So the coup was defeated in a day and a half, which I just want to say, editor's note, is extremely embarrassing. So we can all have a good laugh and chuckle about it and celebrate the US and NATO's continued losses. In line with major losses, we continue to win against the illegitimate state of Israel and the full support of NATO of the Zionist project by the Palestinian resistance and the world's mobilization against it, or against the Zionist project. So just to tie up my section and transition over to Swetha, so Dinanda's last point that she made was that the word terrorism was established as a synonym for communism. But today the word terrorist has been expanded to become a very convenient word or label for anyone that acts as a threat to the Western ruling class and the ruling system. So we've seen this word very eagerly and liberally thrown around to describe Black liberation movements, the anti-Zionist movement. And so the words terrorist or terrorism are being very widely applied by the ruling class and the media to protect their interests. And so I just want to end my section before I hand off to Swetha by saying the US's and NATO's counterterrorism program is the real mass terrorism inflicted on the world's people. And Swetha is going to tell us a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Ariel. Hi, everyone. My name is Swetha. I'm also with DGRO NYC. I'm going to dig into NATO's counterterrorism pillar a little bit more. So this is just like a map for US counterterrorism operations from 2018 to 2020. You can see just like how many of them exist. So as Dinanda and Ariel explained, counterinsurgency and crushing people's struggles is what NATO was forced to do, and they continue to play that role today. Counterinsurgency, the aim of it is to use subversion and violence to destroy people's movements or anything that's a threat to capital and US NATO's goal of expansion and imperial domination. This continues through psychological operations, assassination, torture, surveillance, and other violent methods, as Ariel mentioned. And they employ these operations in countries impacted by US imperialism, as well as right here in the imperial core. So counterinsurgency essentially delegitimizes revolution against imperialism and colonialism and advances a counter-revolutionary agenda with the aim of stopping the resistance of the masses, which it exploits to create its wealth. So as you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so as both Ariel and Dananda mentioned, the US and NATO literally replaced the word communism with terrorism as they ushered in a long-reigning counterterrorism doctrine to protect the ruling class and expand the American empire. So this is like actually a graphic from NATO's capacity building course on counterterrorism, and it literally says here, insurgencies, which they consider like any people's movements or like communist revolutions, can over time become terrorism. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so over the last 25 years, NATO has used counterinsurgency and counterterrorism to devastate the lives of millions with the real aim of continued imperialist plundering of resources and control over West Asia and Africa, as well as quashing people's movements that are a threat to them. Many countries have been destroyed through US and NATO, specifically Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s, Libya in 2011, and Yugoslavia in 1999. But I'm going to dig a little bit more into US and NATO's role in Afghanistan and Iraq in a little bit, because they are the testing grounds for their for their counterterrorism strategies. They subjected countless innocent people to torture, surveillance, and coercive interrogation techniques. And these wars are really what defined and expanded NATO's role as an expansionist tool for imperialist states. In fact, Afghanistan and Libya were, according to NATO, a prelude to discussions of a global NATO. It was essentially a way to use NATO beyond its own charter obligations. And this was first put into motion through the Wolfowitz Doctrine. This was created by the US administration in 1992 after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it essentially defined the US's next phase of strategy for hegemony post-Cold War. And it was first used as justification for their wars and occupation in Afghanistan and Iraq. So rather than simply containing communism, this doctrine now says that the US should now use its military power preemptively and unilaterally. So according to the doctrine, the first objective was to prevent the reemergence of a new rival and to make sure that no hostile powers would dominate a region whose resources could be sufficient to generate global power. They specifically named the region of Southwest Asia due to its resources, especially its oil. The doctrine also said that the US must show leadership necessary to maintain mechanisms to deter potential competitors from aspiring to a larger regional or global rule. So this is essentially the doctrine that Bush and NATO took and ran with. They used terrorism as an excuse to help secure the US's financial capital and expand its domination over the world. So you can go to the next slide. So in the webinar a few weeks ago, we briefly mentioned the counterterrorism pillar of NATO, and we're going to get into a bit more today. So the three strategies that NATO uses and names that it's using are called awareness, capabilities, and engagement. And we're going to get into them and kind of see what they actually mean. So NATO says that they use the first sort of strategy that they use is called awareness. It's a way of sharing their analysis and intelligence on what they perceive as a terrorist threat to any of the member nations of NATO. But what this actually means is that they are essentially developing surveillance tech to surveil and target who they label as terrorists and sharing this data with other imperialist countries. So the photo here is the NATO's hub for the South at the NATO's Joint Force Command in Naples. This hub literally scans the horizon south of Naples, where they consider their threats to be coming from, which is Africa and West Asia. And they collect and analyze this information through surveillance and share this with their partner countries. Next slide. So capabilities is sort of their next strategy. And this essentially means expanding NATO and NATO member countries for capacities for responding to terrorist threats through air defense, maritime security, and protection of critical infrastructure. What this actually means is the expansion of the military-industrial complex in order to terrorize the masses in the imperial core and abroad. An example of what's under their capability strategies are the NATO's Centers of Excellence, which are international military organizations that train NATO members in military operations and assist in doctrine development that these countries will use for plundering the global south. The photo right here is actually a photo of the NATO's airborne warning and control system, which was formed directly because of 9/11. This is an aircraft that is in Turkey, and it can essentially monitor what they quote unquote monitor the busy airspace in Iraq and Syria. So it's another sort of tool for surveillance. And you can go to the next slide. Finally is engagement. So NATO says that engagement is to build capacity and cooperation with governments. But what we actually know this as is coercing countries into adopting US and NATO's anti-terrorism programs in their own countries as a way to expand imperialist interests and secure their control over capital and resources. For example, NATO actually boasts about their support of Jordan's defense and security capacity building. They've supported Jordan in 15 maritime and land border security operations and developed a curriculum for Jordan's counterterrorism education and training. What they're essentially doing is setting up Jordan as a reactionary state to continue their settler colonial project in Palestine. They also have a standardized curriculum on counterterrorism since June of 2020. This is to quote unquote help partners to train to fight terrorism under the framework of NATO. This was first used to teach the military in Ukraine, another one of NATO's imperialist wars. You can go to the next slide. So yeah, the three cornerstones of the counterterrorism pillar from NATO came directly from the horrors that it waged in West Asia over the last 2 decades. So I talked a little bit about awareness earlier, which we say is surveillance. So NATO's Operation Active Endeavor following 9/11 lasted 15 years, from 2001 to 2016. It was an aero-naval surveillance mission, essentially trying to monitor and gather information to control the Mediterranean Sea as a response to the war in Afghanistan. And it was also used to initiate institutional changes in countries to defend against threats to NATO countries. And so, yeah, that's really where a lot of their sort of technology around surveillance came from. So the other major operation, which I will say are part of their engagement and capabilities strategies, was by the International Security Assistance Force mission in Afghanistan, ISAF. You can see the picture of the flag right there. So what NATO did through this mission was to essentially install a government in Afghanistan that was favorable to US and NATO's interests. This mission lasted from 2001 to 2014, and at its peak, ISAF had 400 bases throughout Afghanistan. This was all done alongside US's Operation Enduring Freedom. And next slide, please. Operation Enduring Freedom was essentially the first phase of the war in Afghanistan and the larger war on terror. So this actually was expanded to other countries following the war in Afghanistan. And you could see all the ones listed here. OEF Philippines, OEF Horn of Africa, OEF Trans-Sahara, OEF Caribbean, and Central America. So just to sum up, counterterrorism was used in West Asia to extend US and NATO's imperialist control over West Asia, not only as a way to control oil supplies, but to really increase a hold over their entire region, with plans of expanding into Central Asia and now to counter China. And this is why the US empire and NATO must fall. And I'll hand it over to Cody.
Right on. Thank you so much, Swetha. I hope what everyone is getting from the presentation so far is that NATO is much more than just a European-centered military alliance. It has led to so many overthrows of democratically elected governments, so many attacks on people's rights just to expand political influence and profit. That's what we're fighting up against. So thanks everyone again for jumping on this webinar. My name is Cody. I am the vice chairperson of the US chapter of International League of People Struggle. We are one of the leading members of the Resist NATO Coalition, and we currently have a national campaign called Defend People Struggle that is trying to build up mass opposition against one of these counterterrorism programs that has been inspired by the NATO counterterrorism pillar. So in a very strange way, everything that Swetha just mentioned about the NATO counterterrorism pillar, it has been fueled by all the history that Dinanda talked to us about at the beginning, about COINTELPRO, the McCarthyist era, going all the way back to the Espionage Act. It's been US counterterrorism that has influenced NATO counterterrorism. But in this feedback loop, the NATO counterterror pillar and everything they learned in the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan and all the other areas named has come back and continues to inform and sharpen the blades of US counterterror doctrine itself again. So it's this constant feedback loop of NATO states inspiring each other to be more repressive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this is played out right here in the belly of the beast. We currently have what may be the last few months of the Biden regime, or it could be a few more years, regardless of who wins this election. We've already lost. But the important thing to know about what the Biden administration has been cooking up these last few years is what is presented to us as a new kind of counterterrorism program. It's called the Countering Domestic Terrorism Program, or CDT. Why is it seen as a new kind? Because it's the only counterterrorism program from the federal government of the US that has ever named white nationalists as the #1 domestic terrorist threat. Sounds like something we'd all agree with, right? But why is the most white nationalist, the most white supremacist, most repressive, violent, racist country in the world all of a sudden now pointing to white nationalism as a threat? It's because the Biden administration was trying to look like the good guy after the takeover of the US Capitol and the attempted coup by Trump using the most vicious reactionary white nationalist fascist forces. So it's meant to look like it's fighting back against racism, but in reality, Biden is trying to fool the people. If you read this document, and when I'm done with my small part here, I'll actually share a link to our ILPS US website where we have a primer. That's what you can see to the left here, a primer on the CDT program, so you can learn more about it. I'm just going to do a quick overview. But in essence, it's important for us to know the ways that they are trying to fool us in thinking that this is a more progressive kind of counterterrorism. It's the same old program that is just presented differently. If you jump to the next slide, what I will do is the same way that Swetha did, breaking down the different aspects of the NATO counterterrorism pillar. I am going to break down the 4 pillars of the CDT program. Again, you can read up more about these in our primer. But the first pillar, I'll just read it as it says it. Understanding and sharing information on the full range of terror threats. Now, what does this mean? The reality is that in understanding and sharing information is government-to-government collaboration to crush resistance movements on a global scale. This counterterrorism program, again, using that so-called interconnection and interoperability that the NATO counterterror pillar uses, it means that every single department of government, from the municipal to state, all the way up to the federal, and every civilian department as well, the Department of Education, the Department of Finance, all of these play a role in communicating on so-called counterterror threats. There's even a stipulation in here that gives more access to communication between the US government and its so-called allies or puppet governments, like the Zionist State of Israel, like the reactionary government in the Philippines, like the reactionary government in India, like all of the repressive and imperialist governments in NATO countries as well. It means that this is a interconnection of state repression that we've not seen before. This is information sharing to get at what the quote unquote full range of terror threats are. And we know who they're talking about when the imperialist governments use that term terror threats. That's what we talked about at the beginning of this webinar. We jump to the next slide. We'll go to pillar 2, which is quote unquote preventing domestic terrorism recruitment and mobilization. The reality of this is, what are they actually preventing? They're not preventing terrorism. They are preventing people fighting back against the terrorism of the state. This means mass surveillance and massive black propaganda that is meant to be false and to smear what they call the so-called red propaganda of the mass movement. Remember, we had the history before this when the biggest threat to the US and NATO, which was communism, now just becomes blanketly use the word terrorism anyone to disagree with. It is using this to attack people's organizations and to slow their growth. That is what this means. They are trying to get at all of the ways that mass organizations recruit people to join them and to give anti-imperialist education, just like we're doing right here, and trying to stop it before it happens. If you jump to the next slide, pillar 3 is quote unquote deterring and disrupting terrorist activity before it occurs. What does this mean? It's face-saving and false promises of social change and what they call justice that will never serve the people's needs. This pillar is all about, it starts actually with an admission that the reason why many people turn to quote unquote terrorism, like a blanket definition of that, is because they're lacking something in society. So as a government, we need to give them what they need. We need to work with different nonprofits and aid agencies and schools to make sure that the education is serving our youth's needs. But what this is saying is it's actually getting government surveillance into all of these institutions and using them as a way to further funnel students towards these counterinsurgency programs, trying to push people away from actual people's movements without actually doing anything to meet their needs. This is coming from a profit-oriented and militaristic society. A profit-oriented and militaristic society is never going to meet people's needs until it is no longer profit-driven and militaristic. That's how we know that this pillar is all just false promises. But if you go to the next slide, the final pillar, pillar 4, is confronting long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. Long-term, this program is looking at what are the long-term things that get people to join movements. So this is a long-term strategy. It is an all-out war against the mass movement. And this pillar really gets into all of the different ways that the CDT program is trying to root out people's organizations wherever they are and to smear them in the public and therefore justify putting a target on their back. So many of the same language was in the NATO counterterrorism pillar. It sounds really good. It also is a lot of big words that are kind of hard to understand what they actually mean. That's why it's important for us to understand them as organizers here in the belly of the beast. And it's why we have to throw down against NATO, because of that feedback loop that'll keep sharpening the blades against the people that are being held by the government. And of course, as we know, these US counterinsurgency programs that were the initial inspiration for NATO's counterterrorism continue to be used in other countries all over the world, especially where the US holds on to its neo-colonies. For the next example, I'm going to pass it over to Rolando, who's going to talk about what this has looked like over the years in the Philippines.
Yes, thank you. I'm Rolando from Anagban, DC, pronouns he, him. I'm going to be talking about the case of the Philippines and why is it considered a major non-NATO ally, and how NATO has influenced through US imperialism the Philippines and try to use it as a puppet in its current anti-China rhetoric. So recently, we know about how the Philippines has suffered from disinformation campaigns from the CIA and United States in general about COVID vaccines. How has the United States in general set its foot down on the Philippines ever since the Philippine-American War of 1899 and continued its repression through counterinsurgency tactics and class struggle from the formations of communist groups like the New People's Army and red tagging as counterinsurgency against any people's struggle that currently goes on today. So how has it become a laboratory for different types of torture, like torture tactics, and also water cure was also a effect of this, being the huge amounts of being a usage of huge amounts of water for torture. This is one example. I will go on to how it continues today in the next slide, please. So here's some history. The US RP military bases agreement, ever since the 1950s, it allows for US military bases and US Army from the everlasting effects of World War II to continue their repression in the Philippines from many of the quote-unquote terrorist counterinsurgents that grew out of a broader communist movement that was building up. The Visiting Forces Agreement is an agreement, as well as the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that allows for military bases and US military officials to be exempt from visas. It's ensuring that US military continues its repression through counterintelligence, as well as just broader US imperialist interests in the Philippines to maintain its free trade agreements, as well as dominating power in the region of in the Indo-Pacific. And the war on terror, Mindanao as well, was heavily targeted for presence of ISIS troops, and this was in general counterinsurgency tactics that were used to also repress some of the moral people indiscriminately. And these tactics as well brought in heavier US military personnel and weapons agreements that would ensure a continuing anti-terrorist formation in the modern Philippines. So the next slide, please. So some of the history with the New People's Army is that they are the armed wing of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines that are currently recruiting and have recruited from the rural countryside from the oppressed classes that have been hit from US imperialism ever since the early 1900s. And what the Philippine state has done was continue to target the rural countryside because they would go on to consider anyone that lives in the countryside that are from the oppressed classes to be collaborators or sympathizers of the New People's Army, and they would launch terror tactics using different organizations like the Army of the Philippines, as well as paramilitaries that were largely funded by the Filipino state. And these paramilitaries, I'd say, fit in a lot with Pillar 2 of what was described as trying to create a broader civilian presence in the reactionary counterinsurgent tactics of the Filipino state to serve the US imperialist interests. A lot of them were from religious cults, particularly Christian. For example, Al Samasa, they would use radio stations sponsored by the CIA to center on a God-centered ideology. So we can see the colonial lasting of reactionary tactics live on in these paramilitaries that also continue to harm the people today, as according to human rights groups, as many as 70 out of like 200 per year can be killed by these paramilitaries. Usually their tactics include suspecting any broad political group that's left wing or environmental group of being NPA collaborators. They question this about them as a long-lasting effect of their utilization against the NPA by the Filipino state. Next slide, please. So a build up to the terror campaigns. Many of these in the war on drugs were influenced by the anti-communist crusades of the paramilitaries ever since the Citizen Armed Forces Geographical Unit was enforced through Executive Order 2064. These anti-insurgency campaigns in the countryside would target drug users, not even consider them human in certain cases. A lot of this ideology comes from the manufactured consent of civilian reactionary ideology in saying the war on drugs is a good thing for the Philippines, but it's actually a U.S. Imperialist tactic to further their heavy militarization of the Philippines, and as well as the army, who use the war on drugs to target communists, and as well as do red tagging on political campaigns to wipe them out as a sort of hit two birds with one stone tactic. Next slide, please. So the present day has built off of these tactics. Executive Order 70, a whole the nation approach, would launch a counterinsurgency tactic against the broader communist movement. This was seen with the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict. This prevented peace talks from communists between the Filipino state, and it's a whole organized military tactic to basically go against the communists without any second thought, and human rights violations would continue to be highlighted by human rights organizations from these paramilitaries, and the terrorist labeling by the Filipino state, questioning of people being part of the New People's Army. And these continue today under Marcos Jr., who is the son of the dictator that was overthrown in the 80s, Marcos Sr. Next slide, please. So how the Filipino state serves today as a vessel for war against China. It collaborates with the US to make military agreements for weapons like planes, armored vehicles, small arms, and heavy war buildup is being formed to ally the US with the Philippines. Yes, next slide, please. And how current Buy on USA's US Out of the Philippine campaign is seeking to fight against all of this and the class struggle of the Filipino people against US imperialism is by these campaigns, like the mobilizations to oppose RIMPAC and NATO, the Buy on Peace mission to the Philippines to examine the real struggles of the peasantry and the workers in the Philippines against the Filipino state and their conditions. And they currently conduct political education and mass propaganda to educate about the situation of the Philippines and how even in campaigns like Say No to APEC are part of the broader ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations, work to fulfill a free trade, which is an extension of U.S. imperialism, and falls into the developmental tactics of U.S. imperialism that says, oh, because you're an undeveloped state, you need our support, you need our defenses. No, these are tactics that go against the independence of the Filipino people. Yeah, thank you. I'll hand it over to Sweta again to talk about Stop Operation Kagar.
Thanks so much, Rolando. Hi, everyone. This is Sweta again. I'm going to talk about counterterrorism and counterinsurgency in India, and specifically focus on their current operation called Operation Kagar. So just as some background on India and their relationship with the US and NATO. So as a lot of people know here, last week, the US launched RIMPAC, which is the world's largest joint military exercise, which is taking place around occupied Hawaii. India will actually be participating alongside many NATO countries. Although India isn't actually a part of NATO, India has been a close partner of the US and NATO in their counterterrorism operations specifically. In fact, they're actually a part of something called the Quad Counterterrorism Working Group, which includes the US, Australia, India, and Japan. And they essentially work to address challenges regarding terrorism within the region and support a quote-unquote free and open Indo-Pacific. The US has also put forth proposals for India to join NATO Plus, which is a security agreement between Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, and South Korea. In fact, like the US House Select Committee on the strategic competition between the US and the Communist Party of China. Yes, it's a real committee. I was pretty shocked when I learned about it. They put forth a proposal last year to include India in NATO Plus in order to like ramp up their to deter the aggression of the CCP in the Indo-Pacific region. But as we know, it's essentially strengthening their preparations for Cold War against China. So while RIMPAC is happening in the Pacific, in India, the state is currently waging war through a counterterrorism operation against Adivasi people in central area. Adivasi people are indigenous people in India. And they're doing this under the guise of fighting Maoism, which the Indian state has delegitimized under the label of terrorism. So the actual reason for this war that they're waging against Adivasi people is that the region, which you can see here, is actually really rich in resources that foreign and Indian corporations are vying for. This includes copper, zinc, gold, lead, bauxite, and timber. This is essentially a continued genocide of Adivasi people, as the state is continuing their violent project of displacing Adivasi people from their land in order to plunder the earth for capital. And this has been going on since the founding of the caste system, which started around 3,000 years ago and has continued to oppress Adivasis and other caste oppressed people. So Operation Kagar is the new phase of India's Operation Samadhan Prahar. It's a counterinsurgency campaign against people's movements in India. But before we get into this, I'm going to talk a little bit more about India and the US. So since so-called Indian independence from British colonialism, the US has essentially set up India to be a reactionary base in the Indo-Pacific region. US imperialists and the Indian comprador bourgeoisie and landlord classes share a goal of crushing people's struggles, including the ongoing revolutionary armed struggle by the Communist Party of India Maoist, so that they can continue to displace indigenous people from their land and exploit it for resources. But as we know, the US and NATO has an interest in undermining anything that will disrupt the flow of capital and get in their way of unbridled exploitation of people and people's resources. So one example of the Indian state bowing to imperialist interests is that the Indian government has slowly over the last couple of decades been allowing 100% direct foreign investment in various industries in India over the past couple decades, including in the mining business. So it's basically a way for foreign entities like the US to invest in and control 100% Indian industries. So obviously Western mining companies and banks that invest in mining projects and others have jumped at this opportunity to exploit the massive resources that are present in Central and East India. And the US imperialists and the Indian ruling classes know that if the Maoist revolution in India can advance to a new stage, it will become a grave threat to capitalism. And that's why US imperialists have a large interest in stopping them through counterinsurgency and counterterrorist programs. But as we know, this has impacted any kind of people's struggles, including Adivasi struggle against mining on their land. So what the Indian ruling class in the US have worked to do is scale up India's defense budget to satisfy the imperialist economy spearheaded by the US. In fact, like the US Special Forces and Israel have even trained the Indian army in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency at the jungle warfare schools in India. Since 2000, which is like around the time of US's counterterrorism strategies being exported around the world, India's defense budget went from 14 billion to 81 billion. That's like I can't do math right now, but 14 billion to 81 billion in 2024. So yeah, it's actually, India is also the largest arms importer in the world now. 46% of its arms imports are from the US, and it's also the largest arms customer for Israel. So yeah, I'm gonna get into the two operations that have sort of defined India's counterterrorism operations. You can go to the next slide. So Operation Green Hunt, which was the first operation, and Operation Samadhan Prahar, which is currently going on now, are quite literally copied and pasted from the US's strategy of winning hearts and minds that they used in their counterterrorism operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the stated aim of Operation Green Hunt was to eliminate Maoists in India, which has led to surveillance, red tagging, terror tagging, and incarceration of anyone who tries to resist US imperialism, capitalism, and feudalism in India, especially working class and peasant organizers, caste oppressed people, especially Dalit and Adivasi people, and religious minorities, especially Muslims, across India. Operation Green Hunt actually failed in 2014 due to people exposing the human rights atrocities carried out by the state. But 3 years later, a more intense and repressive Operation Samadhan Prahar started. Their goal is to essentially use shadow intelligence officers, military and paramilitary, police and surveillance tech to crush anti-mining struggles of Adivasis in central and eastern India, and to crush the resistance of the Communist Party of India Maoists. So for these operations, India has received technical and material help from Israel and the UK, which includes drones and aerial bombing technology, as well as the methodology to destroy communist movements. They officially started using these bombs on Adivasis in 2021. They also plan to build 400 operational bases across the states that have rich minerals to surveil, police, and quell people's struggles in those states. Additionally, surveillance drones are actually operated by the Indian Air Force from the National Technical Research Organization, which was an institution established with the help of the NSA in 2010. So another US and India sort of collaboration. So you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So yeah, these operations have really only intensified under the current Prime Minister Modi's fascist Brahmanic Hindutva rule. And so this new phase of Operation Samadhan Prahar, called Operation Kagar, started in January of this year. In January of this year, around 10,000 paramilitary forces were mobilized into a district called Bastar in the state of Chhattisgarh then. And it essentially turned this area into a war zone. And since then, the state has been conducting regular aerial bombings in Adivasi communities using Israel and US-made rocket launchers and drones. The paramilitary have also continued arresting and disappearing people while they continuously kill innocent people under made-up encounters with Maoist fighters. This includes killing a 6-month-old infant, disabled Adivasis, and other people simply fighting for their land. At least 130 people have been killed by the Indian state between January and May of this year. The latest bombing in April came at a time when Adivasis in this area are harvesting mahua flowers. They are essentially, when harvest season comes, folks in this region sleep under the mahua trees to ensure protection of these flowers during the season. And I share this to say that this is a deeply personal fight. Adivasi people have been fighting for their lands for generations, and their fight to stay in the forest is deeply personal, as this is their ancestral lands. They've also continued to resist by organizing sit-ins and protests against this violence. And they're strengthening their campaign to drive out military camps from their communities through mass barricades and protests. One of the longest running protests against paramilitary camps is called Mulvasi Bachao Manch, and it started in 2021 after paramilitary fired on villagers protesting in 2021. And we must support them by resisting NATO and the counterterrorism campaigns that the US and NATO are waging around the world, because as I've talked about, India's counterterrorism strategy, methods, and materials would not exist without that of the US and NATO's. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much to all of our presenters. That was such critical information about NATO and the way that they use this counterterrorism pillar to repress people's movements across the globe. I mean, I really feel like I learned so much new information throughout the whole thing, and I really appreciate it. Before we get into a Q&A session, we just want to talk about some of our closing takeaways. Right, NATO's narrative has been that it's about peace, but it's actually about suppressing anti-imperialist and people's liberation movements, right? And we learned today that the counterterrorism pillar was founded to suppress communist movements, and that NATO has actively committed terrorism against people using this pillar. NATO is counter-revolutionary and talks about supporting people's movements, right? Their narrative in Ukraine is that they are supporting a people's movement, but their actions are always counter to people's resistance. NATO is everywhere, right? The North Atlantic part of NATO is absolutely a misnomer at this point. As we saw in our last webinar and in this webinar, NATO has destabilized people's movements and revolutions across the globe, from the Americas to Asia to Africa. We need to have an internationally united front against this horrendous alliance. And we know that we can win because people's movements have successfully resisted NATO and Western imperialism globally. So again, thank you so much to our presenters. Thanks to everyone who attended this. And if you could go to the next slide, we will do a Q&A for our presenters. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand and we'll call on you, whatever format you prefer. Well, Oh, I was gonna say, we'll give folks a couple minutes to digest, but it looks like we have a question. What are the implications of NATO's Article 5 being activated after 9/11? Does anyone want to grab that one?
I can real quick. It's actually the first example of Article 5 ever being activated. And for folks who don't know, Article 5 of the NATO Charter is probably one of the most significant articles. It's the one that talks about quote unquote mutual defense, saying if one of us is attacked, everyone else will come and defend it. Of course, NATO had all these chances to use it during the Cold War, and it didn't. One thing we talked about in our first webinar was when Greece and Turkey almost went to war with one another over Cyprus. And Article 5 was never used on either side because NATO, like the US and other European countries, didn't want to get involved in this issue. But it shows that NATO has never been the like fully united, unbeatable force. There's always been cracks. There's always been NATO members getting at each other. But when the US is threatened, then it changes the game. And so the US did activate Article 5 of NATO to draw in the vast majority of NATO countries to support with the war on terror. So I think that that's the biggest implication that other speakers spoke about. But it's just an interesting example that there actually were tons of times when Article 5 could have been activated, but it wasn't. But when the US wants it to be activated, that's when it is activated. It also is showing us what will happen if Ukraine, or at this point now, because of recent news, Georgia actually joins NATO. It means that it would directly involve NATO in an all-out war against Russia beyond just the proxy war that's happening in Ukraine right now. That could be potentially a full-blown nuclear winter.
Thanks, Cody. Does anyone else have any other questions? If not, we can talk about what we have coming up.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nisha. I'm with the International League of People Struggle U.S. Country Chapter Steering Committee. I'm very excited to see all the people who are able to join on today. And big shout out again to the Education Committee of the Resist NATO Coalition. Just to kind of bring it back again to those main lessons that were sort of summarized at the end. One, right? A reminder really to emphasize the role of NATO in the world. NATO, despite often using phrasing of defense or protection or whatever, at its heart is designed to attack people's movements fighting for liberation and freedom. Number two, again, the really big thing is that NATO is everywhere. NATO is not confined to one region of the world, but is actually part of the US's broader strategy of repressing people's movements, both in the US, but abroad as well, and tying and bridging that gap. So we learned all of this history. We learned all of these lessons. We learned about the inner workings of the various quote unquote counterterrorism programs, the counterinsurgency programs that the US promotes, the way that it works with puppet governments to continue to preserve its interests. So the question is, what are we going to do with all of this knowledge, right? Of course, knowledge is great, but knowledge is only as useful as it allows us to understand the world and allows us to change it. So I am inviting all of you, and we're inviting all of you to join us in using this and applying it, right? Because we also know that the only way to take down this backwards and vile system is with building a united and fighting mass movement against NATO itself directly and against the broader imperialist system and the US war machine as a whole, which NATO is among the most consolidated institutions. And so one way to do that, just one way, is by joining us on July 6th and 7th in Washington, D.C., where NATO will be rearing its ugly head and deciding to set up shop for its summit, where it will be making major decisions around the new direction that it will be going for the next several years, the new ways to continue to attack people fighting for freedom, right? And the ways that it will continue to instigate and provoke war around the world. And so we're not going to let that happen. We're not going to allow them to proceed according to plan. And so on July 6th, we will be having a People's Counter Summit led by the Resist NATO Coalition, featuring a whole host of wonderful speakers and organizations to share discussion about their movements and how they have been organizing to advance their people's struggles. We'll also have many culturals and opportunities to meet each other. And then, of course, on the next day, we will be having a rally and march, a mass mobilization, beginning at McPherson Park. And we will be also, to the best of our ability, joining forces with the various other groups and people and organizations who are coming together around the understanding that we have to fight and resist NATO until the day that we are able to completely dismantle it and completely dismantle the system that it grows from, right? So I invite all of you to join us on this weekend. And if you're not able to join directly, there's quite a few other ways you can be involved. One, we invite you to continue to share the educational materials that we're putting out, share your organization's analysis or views on why you oppose and resist NATO, perhaps by releasing things on your website or in your communities and so on. We have tons of materials and flyers that you all can use because, again, it's not just in DC. It's not just in DC. You can also donate. We are a people's organization, and so unfortunately, not a lot of major institutions like to fund us. So we're funded primarily through our grassroots fundraising efforts, and also heads up the merch that we're going to sell. We have lovely T-shirts and stickers and pins coming out, so keep an eye out for that as well. And lastly, I really want to put the call out. So this sort of campaign is actually really a sign of a rising tide of higher level of organization, higher level of unity, and higher level of militancy in opposition to US-led war. Many of us in the Resist NATO Coalition are just coming back from confronting the Rim of the Pacific military exercises that are launching in San Diego and will be happening throughout the next month, which are part of the broader US-led war in the world. And the Resist NATO Coalition is coordinating with the Cancel RIMPAC campaign for a global month of action, right? So there will be actually actions opposing all of the sort of fronts of US war around the world, and you all can be part of that. And also, during the week, NATO is actually present. It'll continue to be present throughout the 11th, especially on the 9th to the 11th. And so we're also calling for people to continue to come to DC if you're interested in keeping up the fight during that week. But if you're not able to come all the way to DC, perhaps you're not based close enough, or you're not able to send as many people, or your organization is elsewhere, there are already organizations that are working with the Resist NATO Coalition to plan actions throughout the week in other major cities. And if there isn't one in your city, consider organizing one, and feel free to tag us on social media or share your flyer with us or any materials you're putting out, and we would love to uplift it. So already in Seattle and SoCal, NorCal, there are already events in the works, so keep an eye out for that. So yeah, we want to show the united mass opposition, and ultimately we hope to be side by side with you as we strike a blow against US imperialism and militarism. One blow is one step closer to us building the new world that we want, one without imperialist war and aggression putting its boot on our neck. So thank you all for your time. I'll pass it back to the main facilitators to close us out. And I'm excited to see you all in the streets.
Thank you so much for that. That covers everything for our presentation tonight. So as we said, we recorded this. We'll make sure we send out the recording. to everyone who attended so that you can share it with your networks. And again, thanks so much to everyone who spent your evening with us tonight. And to our presenters.